there's no doubt that the issue of the rise of China is, in my view, the most important long-term national security issue that the United States faces, and how China is going to continue to work with the United States and others fit into the international system or not is a critical issue. And perhaps because I've always been somebody who's seen the glass half full, I actually see a lot of opportunity right now. And in terms of that relationship, in terms of the U.S.-China relationship. And I know that that goes against some of the conventional wisdom out there, particularly after the election. I was with CODEL just last week, led by Senator McCain, to the Halifax International Security Forum. And I'll tell you, the officials there was a lot of hand-wringing, a lot of concerns about the collapse of the Western Alliance system, articles that you've seen, maybe some of you have even written, about how China is going to now move into the Asia-Pacific with economic deals and trade deals and push the United States out of the Asia-Pacific. And I'm not saying that there's no legitimacy to some of these concerns that we've been hearing about, but what I wanted to do this afternoon was propose a more optimistic vision of what is happening now, and an alternative view that's really not out there that much, but I think, particularly in light of what happened in our election, that there are a lot of opportunities, and that's what I wanted to focus on with regard to my remarks this afternoon. I've given this speech a lot over the last couple years, and it relates mostly to American audiences, where I talk about if you imagine the great powers around a poker table. Actually, the first time I gave this speech, the next week, The Economist had the front page cover with the great powers around a poker table. I think President Putin didn't have a shirt on. But it had all the leaders of the world around the table playing cards, literally poker. And if you think about that, and you think about what the United States, relative to any other country, brings to the table, still brings to the table in terms of our comparative advantages, we have a really good hand. We have a really good hand. Let me give you just a sense of what some of those cards are. Some of those aces are, which I think we still have quite a few of. You know, our entrepreneurship, our ability for a young American man or woman to come up with an idea and go to venture capitalists or go to the financial community and commercialize an idea. That's still something that we do better than any other country in the world. We talk about the high-tech sector. You know, everybody thinks about Silicon Valley, but that's all over the United States in so many different parts of the country where we still, again, I think have a high-tech sector that is the envy of the world relative to any other country. Agriculture sector, fishing sector, you think of these basic commodities where, again, as a country, we still feed much of the world in terms of those sectors of the economy. Energy, something that is near and dear to my heart as an Alaskan with a state that has enormous quantities of energy. We are once again have become the world's energy superpower in terms of oil production, in terms of natural gas production, in terms of renewable production. Again, the envy of any country, but particularly countries in the Asia-Pacific like China. You're starting to see, because of that energy renaissance, low-cost energy, a return, believe it or not, of manufacturing to parts of the United States. It still needs to focus a lot more in terms of creating more jobs, but there's an enormous opportunity there. Our military, as somebody who still serves in the U.S. Marine Corps Reserves, I can tell you undoubtedly we have the most professional and most lethal military in the world by far, no doubt about it. Alliances, allies. Again, you look around the world in terms of countries that actually trust the United States. You look at our system of alliances that we've created, whether in the Asia Pacific or in Europe or around the world, and we are an ally-rich nation. And most of our adversaries or potential adversaries are ally poor. Not many people wanting to join the Russia or North Korea club or the Iranian club. And that's another comparative advantage. And yes, even you look at our Constitution and our system of government. Of course, it's a little messy. We just witnessed that. Not always pretty. But the transfer of power between one leader of the United States, the peaceful transfer of power, and another, they don't know how to do that in China yet, and they certainly don't know how to do that in Russia yet. These are all enormous comparative advantages that I think we continue to bring, that we have at that poker table really, really strong cards, a strong hand. So what happened in November? There's been a lot of people talking about what's happened in November. This is my quick take for what it's worth. As somebody who wasn't up for election but campaigned all over the country for a lot of my Senate colleagues who were up for re-election and election. I think most Americans intuitively know this. They know what we have. They know that we still have all these incredible comparative advantages, and yet 2/3 of the country think that we're and have been on the wrong track. So that's a big disconnect. Well, what's the source of the disconnect? From my perspective, the source of the disconnect has been the U.S. economy. And I think the U.S. economy can explain a lot what happened in terms of our election in November. But if you look at the traditional levels of American growth, Democrat, Republican administration, it doesn't matter, for the last 200+ years, the average GDP growth for the United States has been about 3.8, 3.9, almost 4% GDP growth. And sometimes it's much higher, right? In the Reagan administration, we're talking 4.5, 5.5% GDP growth. The Clinton administration was also similarly very strong. But over the last 10 years, our growth has been flat. We have averaged, President Obama is going to be the first president, I think, since we kept taking historical numbers in terms of GDP growth that never hit 3% GDP growth in 1 year. Almost never hit it in a quarter. 3% is not that great. It's not bad, but it's not that great. We've had a lost decade of economic growth. And I think what happened in November was that there are literally millions of Americans who started to believe that the American dream for them and their kids was starting to become out of reach. And that's different for us. The narrative of America is that every generation does better than the last. If you have kids, you know they're going to do better than you. And a lot of people, I think tens of millions, started to think that that was over. And I think that was the main driver of what happened in an election that I think surprised a lot of people. So since I came to the Senate a couple years ago, I focused on this issue a lot. Every time we'd have a new GDP number come out, and 0.5%, 1%, these are the numbers. They're dismal by any historical measure for the United States. I would go down to the Senate floor and ask, what are we doing? Where's the President? Where's the Secretary of the Treasury? What's the plan to grow the U.S. economy? And unfortunately, there wasn't a plan. There hasn't been a plan. This is one thing I've been very critical about with regard to the Obama administration. As opposed to saying, hey, we'll get back to 3.5 or 4% GDP growth, the line that you start to hear around Washington is, well, this is the new normal. Americans don't shoot for 4% anymore, or 4.5 or 5. You need to be satisfied with the new normal of 1.5 or 2% GDP growth. That's the term, the new normal. That's what we should expect. Well, I think millions and millions of Americans rejected that in November. And this is where I wanted to start to talk about the opportunity. So how does this relate to the U.S.-China relationship? Why do I see optimism and opportunity coming out of this election? I think we have the opportunity to play the cards in our hand that I talked about in a much more strategic and forceful and strong way. So let me give you a few examples. I think that the incoming administration is going to be very, very focused on reigniting American economic growth. That's critical, and that's going to be a big difference from the outgoing Obama administration that did not seem to focus, or to be perfectly blunt, care that much that we are growing at 1.5% GDP growth. And as so many of you know, one of the most important coins of the realm of power in the Asia-Pacific is not just military power, it's economic power. And we have not had that in over 10 years. I think if we reignite the American economy, and we can do this, that's going to be a huge opportunity for us and our allies in the region. Let me give you a second example that relates to the first, energy. As I mentioned, we have enormous opportunities with regard to energy, not only for energy production in the United States, but dramatically expanding our economic and our energy security relationship with our allies in the region. My state of Alaska, we've been exporting LNG to Japan mostly for over 40 years. There is an enormous network that we can expand upon for LNG exports, for oil exports, to all of our allies in the region. And again, this is an area where the Obama administration, trust me, was not interested, and the incoming administration of President-elect Trump is interested. This is a great opportunity for all of us in the region. Let me give you one that I know it might surprise you in terms of an opportunity. Trade. If you remember, and a lot of people don't, 8 years ago there was a president-elect who had campaigned on renegotiating NAFTA, was against the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement that President Bush had negotiated, was against the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement that President Bush had negotiated. Do you remember the name of that candidate? It was President-elect Barack Obama 8 years ago. He was the candidate against trade. Okay, what did he do? He came in, understood that this is important. Is that going to happen with the Trump administration? Who knows? But here's one thing that they have that no other president-elect has ever had. We checked this today. It's kind of an interesting statistic. This administration comes into office with trade promotion authority. What does that mean? That is really, really hard to get, the ability to actually negotiate deals, bring them to Congress on an up and down vote. Most administrations have to work very, very hard, spend a lot of political capital to get that power. President-elect Trump comes into office with 4 years of trade promotion authority because we voted on that last year and gave President Obama that authority for 18 months. But now the new administration has that. Will they want to use that? It's a huge opportunity. No other president's come into office with it. I don't know. But I think that it's certainly a possibility. And then fourth, again, this goes back to, in my view, the most important comparative advantage we have in the Asia-Pacific, and that's this incredible network of allies. And again, as someone who spent a lot of time in the region, but has spent a lot of time in the region as a U.S. Senator, what we need to do, and I think we should definitely be doing this, and I do think the incoming administration will focus on this, is deepen our alliances and strategic relationships with traditional partners like Japan, like Korea, like Australia, like Singapore, but take advantage of the opportunities, and they certainly are out there, to reach out and establish stronger relationships with new potential partners. I had the honor of going to Vietnam with Senator McCain, which was quite a trip, to go with a man who played a heroic role in our nation's history with what used to be an enemy of the United States. Well, you don't get the sense that it's an enemy of the United States now. You get the sense that this is a country that there's an enormous upside in terms of our strategic relationship. That's just one example. I had the opportunity to have a discussion with the Prime Minister of India. There's all kinds of opportunities there to deepen our relationship with India. And so to me, the opportunities with regard to our alliances are also very strong right now. So what will China be doing with regard to these kind of issues? Well, you're the thinkers in the room. You're the people who have focused on these issues. I've had the opportunity to learn from many of you. You know, it was a little over 10 years ago that a good friend and mentor of mine, Bob Zellick, talked about our hope that China's rise would lead it to become a responsible stakeholder. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that speech. I think one of you in the room actually wrote that speech, Evan. Is there still an opportunity there? I think what was very interesting about when that speech came out, I had the opportunity to travel to China a number of times as an Assistant Secretary of State with Secretary Paulson when he launched the Strategic Economic Dialogue, and you saw the impact of that strategic concept where the leadership in China, in meetings that I had the opportunity to attend, Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao, Madame Wu Yi, they were all using the term responsible stakeholder in their discussions with American officials. And at that time, it looked like the direction of China with regard to its WTO commitments, when it was opening its economy, when it was meeting most of its commitments, that was a concept that looked like it may take hold. Regrettably, I think in recent years, there have been signs that China has chosen to reject that idea. And there's been a number of experts who have agreed that they're going a different way. There was actually a book recently by Graham Allison and others on Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew that had a number of quotes. And when he was asked about that, he expressed strong doubts that China would want to move in that direction of a responsible stakeholder. And we're starting to see it. I think first in terms of economic policy, you know, in terms of WTO commitments. Right now you see China on a buying spree in many of our countries in the West, in the United States, particularly in Europe, particularly in Germany, with regard to strategic companies. If American or German companies want to go to China and do the same, I think everybody in this room knows what the answer would be. The answer would be no. Well, we need to hold them to the reciprocal commitments they've made in the WTO. There's no doubt about that. And I think, again, with the new administration, you're going to see that. But secondly, with regard to the responsible stakeholder model and whether China is accepting or rejecting that, is obviously the increasingly aggressive policy of intimidation and coercion that China is taking towards its neighbors in the South China and East China Sea and elsewhere. And I think most people here know what's been going on in that part of the world. But what was really striking to me was when The Hague came down with its verdict recently with regard to many of the claims in the region, how quickly and dismissively China treated that ruling. And again, I think that starts to build what Secretary of Defense Carter said at the Shangri-La dialogue last year. Those kind of actions risk erecting a great wall of self-isolation for China. And again, I don't think that's in anyone's interest. But certainly, back to the issue of allies, you're starting to see many, many countries in the region wanting to have closer relationships with the United States because of those kind of policies. So let me end by just mentioning, what's the end goal here? Well, I know that there's been a lot of discussion on Professor Graham Allison's recent article about the Thucydides trap. And I know some scholars don't necessarily like it or agree with it, but I'll tell you an interesting story from my perspective. I read that and had the opportunity to have a discussion with Professor Allison before I had the opportunity to meet with President Xi Jinping when he was in town here with a small group of U.S. senators. And so I went down on the Senate floor and gave a speech on this topic and how we as the U.S. Senate need to focus on this longer-term relationship between the United States and China and the rise of China, and what Professor Allison said about the Thucydides trap, and how the study of looking at situations in history where you've had a rising power moving into an established international order generally has not turned out well, whether it was a Peloponnesian War and Athens and Sparta, or other examples that he lays out in his article. So I gave this speech, I talked about the Thucydides trap, and then I went in and had a meeting with the President of China. Interestingly, guess who raised the issue of the Thucydides trap in that meeting? Xi Jinping. So it was quite interesting. So I think there's clearly a common interest that we don't fall into that trap. And what I am arguing this afternoon is that if the United States, as a result of this administration change, can move into a position where we are unleashing our economic growth back to traditional levels of GDP growth at the 3.5% or 4.5% GDP growth, this will create opportunities. It will also help the U.S. engage China from a perspective of opportunity and strength. And I think that's critical. It's not only critical for us, it's critical for our allies in the region, and it's critical from China's perspective. Because, as I mentioned, over 10 years ago in his responsible stakeholder speech, Bob Zoellick ended that speech by mentioning this very issue. The trepidation is not the position from which the United States conducts its most engaged and important and successful foreign policy, but it's from a position of confidence. He said at the end of his speech, "You hear voices that perceive China solely through the lens of fear, but America succeeds when we look to the future as an opportunity, not when we fear what the future might bring." So I think there are enormous opportunities here. We're going to get to work on those in the Senate with the new administration, and I want to thank all of you again for all the great work that you do to keep us aware of the critical issues and to make sure that these kind of opportunities are the kind of opportunities that we seize in the international realm. Thank you very much.